Today Games Workshop have deigned to show us some of the forbidden lore of the Thousand Sons, with a few of their options from Psychic Awakening, Ritual of the Damned. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. And also welcome to the channel's first Chaos video. So far we've managed to resist the allure of the Dark Gods, but have been quite interested in what the Thousand Sons are getting out of this book, so we're going to have a look through the leaks from Warhammer community. Now the Thousand Sons took a bit of a hit with the recent chapter approved, with both their Demon Princes and Zangors rising in points, and these were two of the core units that were being used in efficient Thousand Sons armies. Hopefully this book will give them a bit of a new lease of life. It will be good to see more of their unusual options on the tabletop again. The main things that the Thousand Sons seem to be getting from this book are the options to dedicate themselves to one of the 9 cults of the Thousand Sons. These are supposed to be the different cults that were prevalent on Prospero before the Legion got a little bit dusty, and from the ones that we have available, it looks like they'll represent different facets of sorcery and Tzeentch. The preview says that these cults will give Psykers in the detachment access to additional psychic powers, warlord traits and relics. The way that this is worded implies that each cult will give you multiple ones of these, but to be honest, these Warhammer community previews aren't always 100% accurate with their fine details of the rules, but I think it's a safe bet to say that each one of these cults will give you at least one additional psychic power, warlord trait and relic. This is definitely a good thing, as having access to more options while taking none away will only make the army stronger, but they haven't actually said whether there's going to be any overarching army-wide special rule that you get for having a pure Thousand Sons detachment yet, in the same way that the Space Marines and the Sisters got, but the Eldar, Chaos Marines and Tyranids did not. So I guess we'll have to wait and see that. In the meantime, let's look at the confirmed new rules. We've got a psychic power from the Cult of Time. The power is called Time Flux, and it looks like a really good one. Time Flux has Warp Charge 5, and if you manifest it, then select one friendly Cult of Time infantry unit within 6 inches of the Psyker, then you can restore one model to the squad with full wounds, and if you roll a 9 or more on an unmodified psychic test, then you restore D3 models to the squad, again with full wounds remaining. Now I think that this is a really strong power personally. Being really easy to cast is great, and having the option for a boosted success result if you get lucky is just even better. This power is more helpful than the typical healing abilities that you see on the table, such as the Space Marine Apothecary for example, because every time this goes off, provided you've lost a unit in the squad, then you just get an entirely free model back. You don't have the slightly less good result of just healing a injured model 1 wound, which is nowhere near as valuable as returning a slain model to the squad. Obviously this is going to have great synergy with the more expensive infantry units in the Thousand Sons army list. I'm particularly thinking things like Rubricae Marines and Scarab Occult Terminators, as obviously the more expensive the model that you use this on, the better value that you're getting out of the cast. It's fortunate that the psychic phase happens before the shooting phase, because it means that you could potentially restore a model to the unit and then also shoot with it in the shooting phase and charge in the charge phase. So you're going to be getting immediate value out of any of the models that are restored, and of course your opponent will have to kill them all over again come their turn. Having this plonked somewhere in your Thousand Sons battle line certainly seems like a reasonable idea. In a game of 40k, you're going to take casualties, and unless the opponent wipes out entire squads, you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to restore models to your army with this power. So overall, strong choice. It'll be interesting to see how it compares with other options from Psychic Awakening. Next up we have a warlord trait for the Cult of Duplicity, which I'll be honest has a bit of an interesting name. I mean, I'm not entirely sure whether you know if these guys are going to turn up when they say they will when the battle's raging. I can't help but think that calling yourself the Cult of Duplicity might hamper your ability to make deals in Thousand Sons society, but who knows. Anyway, their warlord trait is Duplicitous Tactician. This deceitful warlord deploys false images of his warriors to confuse and confound the foe, the very act being a veneration of the Great Conspirator. We've seen this trait before, in various guises throughout the codexes. Basically at the start of the first battle round before the first turn begins, you select up to D3 Cult of Duplicity units from your army, you remove those units from the table and set them up again as per the normal deployment rules, and if you redeploy a transport like this, then its contents come too. Not too much to say about this one, we've seen it before, and it's most certainly one of the stronger traits. Positioning in the deployment phase is one of the most important aspects of Warhammer 40k, and these guys being able to perfectly counter-deploy your opponent, even after you know who's going first and the seize rolls have been made, could allow you to position units for optimum first turn strikes, get them just in range of some enemies, deploy key units suddenly out of line of sight so your opponent's short-range weapons won't be effective at all turn 1, or perhaps deploy your anti-infantry elements to counter enemy infantry, or your anti-armor elements to counter enemy tanks. There really are a ton of options with this one, and this is one of those traits that will really buff your army as a whole. Moving on now, we have the Cult of Change, and their Sorcerous Arcana relic is the Capricious Crest. The Capricious Crest is an ancient helmet with a form constantly in flux. When the bearer takes to the field, it might appear as an avian skull, but on their return it might have the appearance of a tall headpiece with an all-seeing eye at its centre. None can tell if it's a corrupted machine spirit responsible for this, or if a denizen of the warp resides within the helm. What is certain is that the innate power of change emanates from the relic, its mercurial nature reaching out across the battlefield to cheat the enemy of their psychic gifts, while granting sorcerous boons to unworthy allies. Once per turn, when a psychic test is taken for a model within 18 inches of a model with the relic, you can change any roll of 1 to a roll of 6 if it's in your army, and you can change any roll of 6 to a roll of 1 if it's in your opponent's army. Now, I think that this is a really strong relic as well, personally. There are going to be times when you're going to just roll low for your psychic power, even with the multiple buffs that the Thousand Suns have access to. This is far, far better than having a spare command reroll per turn, as you will just automatically get to that roll of 7, which usually means that you will pass the psychic power even if you roll a double 1. So provided you keep this somewhat near the majority of your psychers, you'll pretty much not need to spend a command reroll on a psychic power for the first one that you fail. You can just automatically do it with this, which is so much better as it doesn't cost you a command point per turn, and this is guaranteed not to fail. It will basically just auto-pass that psychic test. The psychic denial aspect of it is also useful too. As ever, I'm not always the most convinced on the 18-inch range of these ones, as it is usually possible to fall back out of range to cast your power if it's going to be a problem, unless you happen to have some sort of psyker that's also wanting to charge the enemy as well. But if for whatever reason you can make it happen so your opponent's psyker is within 18 inches of this, then you could pretty much use this to know if you can auto-fail a psychic test by changing a 6 to a 1. And even better, if you get very lucky and your opponent rolls a 6 and a 1, so a 7, you can turn that lightly passed psychic power into an automatic Perils of the Warp, and this could be worth a few mortal wounds on your opponent's psyker. Because the effect is once per turn, this will, rules as written, apply once in your turn and once in your opponent's turn, otherwise they'd have written battle round. Finally, another situation to look out for would be if you're casting Smite and you happen to roll a 5 and a 1. Turning that 1 into a 6 could mean that you get an automatic d6 Smite, which is going to be very nice in terms of the mortal wound output. It's also worth noting that this relic applies to any of the psychers in your army, not necessarily just Thousand Suns, so could be good casting support if you have psychic powers coming in from other disciplines, whether that's demons making some plague bearers harder to hit, or Death Guard throwing some plague spells around. So very nice, pretty flexible. This is certainly a good option for being a generic helpful buff over a wide patch of a predominantly psychic army. Our final piece of information is a stratagem called Risen Rubricae, a 1 command point stratagem that you use during deployment when you set up a unit of Rubric Marines. That unit can be set up anywhere on the battlefield that's more than 9 inches from the enemy deployment zone and any enemy models. Furthermore, you can only use this stratagem once per battle. Now, I read this wrong the first time. I thought that this was just one of the generic deep strike stratagems where your Rubric Marines will be coming in turn 2 or turn 3. But it isn't that. It's basically giving them the equivalent of scout deployment from Codex Space Marines. So you can essentially have these start in the midfield, maybe hunker down on some midfield objectives, maybe get ready to take the fight to the enemy and shoot and charge them turn 1. I think that having access to this for just 1 command point is absolutely great, particularly when you can put it on a decently durable unit like Rubric Marines. It could be particularly helpful in matchups, say like Raven Guard, who like to flood the midfield with lots of infiltrator units and Invictor warsuits. By plopping down a unit of Risen Rubricae in the midfield before they can set up any of their units, you could just zone out a huge portion of the battlefield where enemy infiltrators can't set up. Other applications could be putting a unit of Rubric Marines out of line of sight, moving them through ruin walls turn 1 ready to shoot the enemy, or perhaps deploying them ready to make a first turn charge against any enemy shooting elements that could easily be tied up turn 1. I know they're not necessarily the strongest in close combat, but if they're stopping something powerful like a Lehman Russ or a Land Raider from shooting, it's probably still worth making that charge. So that's a solid option then. The wording from the preview implies that they have a whole bunch of stratagems that are going to just be made available to all of the Thousand Sons, rather than just cutting them up depending on these individual cults. Other than that, they give us the names of the cults, which are Prophecy, Time, Mutation, Scheming, Magic, Knowledge, Change, Duplicity, and Manipulation. So that's going to be a whole ton of warlord traits, powers, and relics going around. I'm personally looking forward to seeing what all of these armies get in Ritual of the Damned, and I'll most certainly be covering it when we have more information. Check back with me sometime later this week if you want to see the inevitable Dark Angels preview coverage. And feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more 40k tactics and strategy content like this. I do of course have a Patreon page, which helps keep the channel afloat, so any contributions are greatly appreciated, particularly if you're watching a lot of my videos, and of course a big thank you to all of my current Patreons. Thanks again for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.